Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host, and you're joining us for another episode with His Excellency Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome.
Hey, Brandon. Good morning. Always great to be with you.
It's good to be with you, too. You know, we're creeping up here on our 100th episode. I think this is number 91. Can you believe that?
Serious? No, honestly, I can't. It seems like, I don't know, I would have said we've done, 20 or 30 of these things.
And, they're each like 25, 30 minutes. That means we've been talking together for like 45 hours or 50
We both
hours.
need to get a life. Huh? No, it is unbelievable. I never would have guessed we had nearly 100 of these things.
Yeah, it's a good moment here, and I want to encourage all of our listeners here to support Catholic podcasts. There's a huge and growing number of great Catholic podcasts here. I'm going to tick off just a few of my favorites. There's the Catholic Stuff You Should Know podcast with some young priests from Denver. There's Pints with Aquinas with Matt Fradd, a young Australian Thomist. Catching Foxes. There's Made to Magnify, Fountains of Carrots. Leah Darrow's podcast, Do Something Beautiful. And then another one I know you've been on, Bishop, Three Dogs North with some Mundelein seminarians and priests.
Yeah, great
So
guy.
lots of great stuff out there. So please, if you like the Word on Fire show, subscribe to some of these other podcasts too. We need more Catholic listeners for this growing medium, and there's just a lot of good stuff out there. So that's our little plug here to support the world of Catholic podcasting. Okay, Bishop, let's move into today's topic, which is called, Does Religion Have a Smart People Problem? We see articles and surveys like this pop up from time to time suggesting that religious people are, by whatever criteria they determine, dumber than the general population. Let me give a couple of examples here, then I want to get your thoughts. One article just popped up a month ago that said, this was the title of it, a scientist looked through 63 studies to conclude atheists are more intelligent than religious people. There was another recent article in Newsweek which began with the line, atheists tend to be more intelligent than religious people because they're able to rise above the natural instinct to believe in God or gods. Bishop,
Not that it's prejudiced or anything.
Right. It's kind of a loaded introduction. What's your initial impression of these sorts of surveys?
My initial impression is if you want to see proof that someone's dumb, follow these indications. I mean, those are extremely dumb observations. So, I mean, that's just the worst kind of ad hominem argument anyway. But, it's a lot of people living in a secularist echo chamber where they just hear each other's point of view. Of course, they're going to see someone from outside that echo chamber is just hard to fathom, Let's return to argument. Because the name-calling thing is not going to get us anywhere. If they just stand from the outside, again, in their sort of echo chamber and say, well, anyone that doesn't agree with me is obviously an idiot, well, then we're not getting anywhere. So I would just say, instead of calling other people dumb, why don't you act smart and actually engage them in argument?
Whenever I read these, I think they're all just examples of posturing where they're trying to appeal to some authority. And didn't Thomas Aquinas say that this form of argument, the appeal to authority, is the weakest form of argument?
Yeah, no, sure. That's what I'm saying. So much of the discussion and so many issues just elides argument. You know what I mean? Is either it goes into ad hominem, it does a red herring, it introduces some completely irrelevant point of view, but we assiduously avoid arguing the issue. So it's deeply annoying, and yeah, it's unconvincing in the extreme, and it's also mean-spirited, So where's that designed to get you? It's not advancing the argument rationally. It's just making religious people feel that they're unwelcome, if I can use that jargon term today, that we're unwelcome around the table of conversation. Well, that's convenient, So hey, you're not welcome, so you're outside of our little echo chamber. So obviously you're not intelligent. See, a lot of it is it's that question begging quality, So intelligent people are those who are around the table. But we don't allow your type around the table. Therefore, you must be unintelligent. Who's determining, by the way, what intelligent is? See, because to my mind, and we'll get to this, I think an awful lot of the atheist point of view is stupid. Not to put too fine a point on it. So, I mean, I can stand up on my high horse, I guess, and say, well, you people are all stupid. What does that accomplish? What we should do is return to argument. Return to the argument. Let's have it out. But we're not going to get anywhere with this kind of name calling.
All right. So we've got the the emotional reactions out of the way, and we're moving past this initial condescension. Let's dig a little bit more deeply into the numbers here. Now, I know a lot of people, a lot of Christians get wary when they discover that, say, the majority of scientists are atheists or that they lack a belief in God, because most of us in our culture think, oh, scientists must be the smartest people around. Does that bother you, or has that ever bothered you that the majority of scientists don't seem to believe in the God of Christianity?
Well, the first thing to point out is this question of the surveys and how these numbers are being generated. So that's the first question, because there's a lot of concern that these are done in a very, prejudiced, loaded way. But secondly, I'd say this, Brandon, that a scientist qua scientist cannot adjudicate the question of God, because God is not an item or object within the universe. You can't use the scientific method of observation, measurement, hypothesis formation, experimentation to determine the truth or falsity of the claim that God exists. Therefore, what a scientist qua scientist says about God in a certain way is a matter of irrelevancy. Who cares? They can't adjudicate the question. It's like saying, most literary scholars that deny the theory of relativity. Well, they're in no position to talk about it. It's not their area of expertise. So in a way, no, I don't really care what scientists say about it. But a third observation is this. My experience when I read these things and actually listen to the quote unquote scientists, they don't know what we mean when we use the word God. They think of God as some big item within the universe for whom we look for evidence in the scientific sense. Most of them I have found, and this is whether you're Hitchens and Dawkins or many of their disciples, they are not philosophically sophisticated. They don't know how to articulate arguments that the great philosophers have. They don't know what Aquinas, for example, means when he makes his arguments. So in a way, they're not really qualified because this is not a scientific question, the question of God. But then secondly, they often don't know what we mean when we say God. So that's why the scientist's objection doesn't strike me as too persuasive.
A couple of years ago, there was a scholar, Elaine Eklund, who produced a book called Science vs. Religion, What Scientists Really Think. And what she found, which I thought was interesting, was in the course of her interviews, she discovered that many scientists rejected religion for personal reasons prior to becoming scientists, and they entered the scientific fields precisely because they were naturalists.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Oh, that makes sense to me, because what you and she are referring to, naturalism, is not a scientific perspective. That's a philosophical position. Now, we can argue for it or against it. I think it's an extremely unpersuasive position, namely that all that there really is the realm of the material or the empirically verifiable. That's not a scientific conclusion. That's a philosophical position, So I find that persuasive, that people, for whatever reason, maybe they're more personal than intellectual, get drawn into that point of view, and therefore they become scientists. But see, the prior question is that a legitimate worldview? And I would say you can make very plausible philosophical claims that it's not a legitimate worldview.
So the place where I got the title for this episode from, I pulled it from an article from Salon magazine, which again published a similar piece along these same lines, talking about religion's smart people problem. That's where I got the phrase for the title of the show. But in that article, interestingly, it claimed not only that the majority of scientists doubt, it also found that 86% of professional philosophers today don't believe in God. What do you make of that? Is that worrisome that so many philosophers also doubt that God exists?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because I've been around the academic world for a long time, and what happens in a lot of university situations, in a lot of departments, is a particular point of view begins to hold sway. If the people holding that view get in positions of power within a department, then they're in charge of hiring and firing. They're in charge of approving dissertations. They're in charge of setting the tone for the department. Therefore, it's not surprising that in a relatively short time, a department can go from largely believing to largely unbelieving. Now, I won't name names, but there are several Catholic universities I can think of that began with strongly believing departments of philosophy, philosophers that believe in God, and were mounting very powerful arguments for that position. If by certain political moves, an atheist or agnostic group gets in charge of the department, in short order, they can change it, hiring and firing in accordance with their view, but also encouraging and discouraging doctoral students to write ways that they want or don't want them to write. What happens is, in time, you get what I referred to earlier as the echo chamber, is that almost all quote unquote professional philosophers now have this, highly secularist or naturalistic or scientific perspective. Because again, I find when I actually read the quote unquote philosophers or professional philosophers, often they're not really up on the great arguments for God's existence. They offer straw man arguments. And again, given the fact that philosophy has become so compartmentalized that you can become your doctorate in philosophy, become a professor of philosophy, and you've got a very, very narrow focus in your area of research. Philosophical generalists who have a sense of the kind of overview of philosophical questions, they're disappearing more and more, So for those reasons, again, I don't find it all that surprising, especially as so many of our universities, and I'm sad to say it, but our Catholic universities too, are trying to ape the great secular academies. And so one of the signs of that is, we'll hire more and more atheists in our philosophy department. It makes us more like, the respected mainstream universities. So no, it doesn't really surprise me that much that a high percentage of professional philosophers don't believe in God. Again, what we said earlier remains. Let's return to the arguments, because we can knock numbers around and percentages all day, but it doesn't really get to the truth of the matter. Is it philosophically viable to believe in God or not? Let's return to argument.
I want to stick here with the statistics just for one more question. The survey that the Salon magazine piece cites, noting that 86% of professional philosophers say they don't believe in God. Interestingly, it breaks that percentage down by different subdisciplines within philosophy. And I think you mentioned this, Bishop, when this survey first came out. You just talked about the sort of hyper specialization or compartmentalization of philosophy. But this survey found that of those philosophers who specialize in the philosophy of religion, so presumably those who would be most familiar with these arguments, something around 75% of those people are theists, so they do believe in a personal God. What do you make of that? Yeah,
well, that makes sense to me. That would be consistent with this view that if you are focused on this area, you know it well, maybe you're finding these arguments pretty persuasive. So that doesn't really surprise me. But academic politics, Brandon, it's a big issue. It has been for a long time. But the truth of the matter, often that's like secondary or tertiary consideration. It's that your opinions are acceptable within the academy today and according to its standards. And that's a serious problem, I think, is why have we felt obligated, and I would again say especially in the Catholic university world, why have we felt obligated to ape the great secularist universities? Why is that our goal?
All right. Well, I think that's enough dwelling on the stats and the surveys, because I agree that even if 99% of philosophers believed in God, so what? I mean, would that mean that the arguments are necessarily true? So let's back up a little further away from those statistics. And let me ask you this. In my interactions with a lot of other millennials, I get this sense there's this pervasive atmosphere that suggests Christianity is for simple-minded people. It's for kids, and so you sort of grow out of it, or it's for old people who really don't know any better. Do you get this sense, too, from the general culture that most people assume Christianity is simple-minded? And if so, what do we do about it? How do we correct it?
Well, first of all, I'd say yes, and that's because of this general cultural attitude. I think, Brandon, in my own lifetime, there's been an extraordinary trickle-down effect from the high academy. I remember my great mentor, Robert Sokolowski, said one time that you go back to the 1950s in America, almost everybody believed in the great biblical narrative, almost everybody. And that meant, quote unquote, ordinary people and high academics. And I think he's right about that. If you went into universities back in, let's say, 1950, you'd find most people subscribe to it, But there's been, let's say, in the last 50 years or so, a steady trickle-down effect. And again, as these departments have morphed into more and more secularist and atheist departments, these are the people that teach freshman philosophy. These are the people that teach the elective courses. These are the people that direct dissertations. And so this will start having an effect. Now, those people get out into the wider culture. They become themselves teachers and catechists, in a religious context. It trickles down eventually into the general population. And it produces this, I would say, illusion that religion, it's just for, simple-minded people. Boy, it wasn't the case up until, if Sokolowski's right, maybe 1950. And look at the people in our great tradition, some of the brightest that have ever been produced by Western civilization, and not just explicitly religious people like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, but, Johann Sebastian Bach, Isaac Newton, who were profoundly religious people. And to say, therefore, it's only dumb people take this seriously. That's much more of a reflection of our culture than it is the truth of things.
I remember when you were on the Dave Rubin show, and you're probably too humble to admit this, but one of the most common refrains in the comment boxes of that interview series was so many atheists and agnostics were surprised because for the first time in their life, they heard a smart Christian. And they would say that. They said, this is the first time I've heard a smart, articulate Christian. And that just deeply saddened me. I thought, how could that be that they had never come across a smart Christian before? What do we do about that?
I'll tell you something else now. I'm on a roll, I guess. Is part of the problem is, I think, the secular culture and the universities and so on. But, in some ways we met the enemy and it's us. The Catholic Church after Vatican II, and despite Vatican II, I would say, not because of it, despite it, dumbed down our religion. My generation was the first one to get it. A very dumbed down approach to Catholicism is we didn't go into apologetics. We didn't look at philosophy. Religion became largely a matter of feeling, and social justice, that got emphasized very strongly. God bless it. I'm all in favor of it. But the intellectual side of the faith tended to be undervalued. And sermons the last 50 years, to be honest, works of apologetics, the engagement of the culture, not just surrendering to it, not just pandering to it, but really engaging it intelligently. There was not enough of that, in my judgment. And so that also contributed to the view that religion is, kind of for simple-minded people. So the culture, yes, but in some ways we met the enemy and it's us.
One thing I always like to bring up as sort of a trump card to this suggestion that religion has a smart people problem is that many of the greatest scientific luminaries were not just religious, but deeply devout Christians. And they seem to debunk this smart people problem in their very persons. Can you talk about some of these great scientific founders?
Yeah. How about Descartes? How about, of course, Copernicus? How about Newton himself, whom I mentioned, who was profoundly interested in religious matters. Gregor Mendel, coming now into the 19th century. Georges Lemaitre, my favorite example from the 20th century. But as you suggest, the founders, go back to the 16th and 17th centuries, the founders learned their mathematics and learned their astronomy and learned their logic precisely in church-sponsored universities. That was the matrix out of which the science emerged. Don't forget figures like Albert the Great. Don't forget figures like Francis Bacon and so on. Figures who came out of the Christian university world and provided the conditions for the possibility of the emergence of the physical sciences. So again, we're always dealing with the Galileo myth, and not denying the complexity of the Galileo situation. When I say the Galileo myth, I mean this stubborn view that the only way to articulate the relationship between religion and science is one of hostility, that science emerged out of this terrible struggle against obscurantist religion. That simply does not hold up to any serious historical scrutiny. So we need to tell our story in a much more compelling way.
Well, it's time now for one of our questions from our listeners. If you have a question, we'd love to hear it. Just send it to us by visiting askbishopbarron.com, and you can record your question on any device. Today's question comes from Shauna. Here it is.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Shauna calling from St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm a fairly recent convert to the Catholic Church, and my question has to do with your show on beige Catholicism. I couldn't help when listening to that episode and listening to your sort of antidote, your alternative to beige Catholicism, but think of my experiences with the Catholic lay movement, Communion Liberation. I'm wondering if you're familiar with CL, Communion Liberation, and what your take is on these ecclesial movements within the Church. Thanks.
Yeah, good. Thanks for that question. I'm no expert by any means. I know CNL. I admire it. Giussani has been someone that I've looked to with admiration for a long time. He was a very important player for John Paul II and for Benedict XVI. And speaking generally, yeah, I love the new ecclesial movements that have happened since Vatican II. They're one of the signs of the Spirit, I think. Word on Fire, I envision maybe someday growing into something like an ecclesial movement. So I'm with it. I mean, I think the Spirit's always at work, and certain forms that have been very effective in the life of the Church maybe aren't as effective as time moves on, and the Spirit calls it to something new. And I think the popes have recognized that the new movements are a sign of the Spirit. I go back to Cardinal George, my mentor, that especially during times of crisis, that's when the new orders and the movements arise. And he kept saying, where are they? Where are the movements? Where are the orders? Because we've been going through a time of crisis, both moral and intellectual. And so I welcome and applaud the new movements as part of this spiritual revival.
Well, thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. Listen, here's your homework for this episode. Assuming you're already subscribed to our show, the Word on Fire show, go subscribe to one more good Catholic podcast today. I shared some of my favorite ones at the beginning of the episode. There are dozens more that I didn't even mention. So go find another good Catholic podcast and subscribe to that one too. Well, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.